Welcome everyone to this Earth Science lesson on pressure centers. Today we're going to attempt to learn enough that you'll be able to compare and contrast air movements in cyclones versus anticyclones. This topic corresponds to section 19.2 of your Earth Science textbook. And I'd like to just give you a quick overview on the two types of pressure systems and have you learn a couple important details about both of those. First system that we look at is called a low pressure system. And this diagram here is a good way to illustrate a low pressure system. You've already probably seen the L that is commonly used to denote these low pressure systems. And there's a couple other details in this image that are useful for us. Notice that in our low pressure system, they've modeled that as a red L. Red may be indicating something warm. Warm air typically rises, so a low pressure system is associated with rising air. And so at the surface of the Earth, they've labeled that surface convergence with arrows pointing inward, filling in that rising air. And then at the top, they've labeled that divergence. And divergence means moving apart, which is what happens when the air reaches some elevation. All right, so these low pressure systems are sometimes called cyclones. I like my students to remember cyclone is a low pressure system. So if you say that word right, you can hear the word low in the middle of it. In these cyclones, the winds tend to go counterclockwise around the center. Counterclockwise. And as we mentioned already, because the pressure is low, that indicates air that is moving upward. That's how a low pressure system is created. The air from that localized area moves up, leaving behind less pressure because the air is moving away from that area. And this kind of a pressure system typically is associated with clouds, as we learned already. A rising air mass tends to get cooler and expand, and that's the perfect recipe for cloud making. Air that is cooling and expanding, oftentimes, if there's moisture in it, will create clouds. And even possibly precipitation if there's enough moisture. Those clouds, those rain droplets, moisture droplets, turn into rain and fall back to the surface. We're going to contrast this with a high pressure system. So high pressure systems are denoted oftentimes with the letter H, that's blue. A high pressure system is associated with air that is sinking or subsiding is the term that they use. When that sinking air reaches the surface of the Earth, it moves outward. So the term there again is divergence. So at the surface we see divergence, and then up at altitude and above that area we've got a convergence of air. Air coming together then sinks, falls to the surface, and undergoes divergence. So these pressure systems, a high pressure system, would be called an anticyclone. Remember, anti means opposite of, so a lot of the behavior of these air systems is going to be the opposite of what we see with the cyclone. And again, a good way to remember anticyclone, if you pronounce that word just right, you can hear the word high in the middle of it. Anticyclone. That's how I like my students to remember that these are associated with high pressure systems. In an anticyclone, the winds go clockwise around the center. And I'll give you a good way to remember that in just a minute here. High pressure systems are associated with air that is moving downward. That's what creates the high pressure, the extra pressure by extra air that's moving into an area. That creates a high pressure system. And when we have a high pressure system, this falling air typically creates clear skies. So if you're checking a barometer every day and noting what's going on with the pressure, you'll see that when the pressure goes down, that is associated with cloudy weather or possibly even precipitation. And when the barometric pressure reads higher pressure, This is associated with clear skies, and that's because we've got sinking air, and sinking air tends to not form clouds. It's the opposite of the conditions needed for cloud formation. So here are those two processes side by side. Our cyclone, or our low pressure system, rising and creating clouds, and our anticyclone, sinking air with clear skies. All right, I'd like to wrap up this lesson with a little graphic to help you remember about the direction that these air masses move. This is a picture. I don't know if you can tell what it is, but it's a high clock and a low counter. The high clock is to help us remember that the pressure systems that are high tend to move clockwise. The low counter tells us if the pressure system is low, those tend to move counterclockwise. High clockwise, low counterclockwise. All right, I hope that this is a nice little way for you to remember the details that we're going to need for air pressure systems this unit.